Every parent's worst nightmare becomes one little girl's reality when the people she trusted most in the world simply walk away. 6-year-old Opal sits beneath an old stone bridge, crying into her hands, wondering what she did wrong to make her family stop loving her. The desert is quiet, except for her soft sobs. But high on the ridge above, Dezba, an Apache warrior, hears every tear. This hardened man lost his own daughter to soldiers 3 years ago, and something about this abandoned child stirs memories he thought were buried. In the 1870s Arizona Territory, Apache and white settlers are sworn enemies. Blood has been spilled on both sides for decades. But when Dezba climbs down from that ridge to approach this crying child, he's about to make a choice that will change everything. What happens when the most unlikely person becomes the only one willing to help? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona desert as Dezba remained motionless on the rocky outcrop, his weathered hands gripping the ancient medicine pouch that hung from his neck. Inside the leather bundle, sacred items told the story of his life. Sage blessed by his grandmother, a fragment of turquoise from his first hunt, and most precious of all, a small carved horse no bigger than his thumb. He had whittled that toy from pine wood 3 winters ago, back when laughter still echoed through his wickiup and tiny hands reached for his face each morning. Ayella, his daughter's name, still cut through him like a cavalry saber. The child below continued her quiet weeping, and each sob seemed to pierce the scar tissue around Dezba's heart. She couldn't be much older than Ayella had been when the blue-coated soldiers came thundering through their peaceful camp at dawn, sabers flashing, rifles barking death across the morning calm. He closed his eyes, remembering how his wife Itzel had shoved Ayella behind a mesquite bush, whispering fierce prayers to protect their little one. But prayers proved no match for bullets that day. Down in the shadow of the bridge, Opal Crawford, though she wouldn't answer to that name much longer, pressed her small back against the cool stone and tried to understand what had happened to her world. Just yesterday morning, she had awakened in her narrow bed in the Crawford farmhouse, the same bed where Martha Crawford had tucked her in each night for 3 years, with stories and gentle kisses on her forehead. The same kitchen where Uncle Silas would lift her onto his shoulders while Aunt Martha kneaded bread and hummed old hymns. But yesterday everything changed. "We can't keep her no more, Martha," she had heard Uncle Silas say through the thin cabin walls as she played with her cornhusk doll near the hearth. "The bank's foreclosing next month, and we barely got enough to get ourselves back to her sister's place in Missouri. Besides, with these Apache raids getting closer to town, it ain't safe having a child out here." Martha Crawford's voice had trembled with tears. "But Silas, she's been like our own daughter since her parents died. We promised my sister we'd care for her, and we have for 3 years. But I ain't got work. The crops failed again, and we're down to our last $20. You want to watch her starve? At least in town someone might take her in, someone with means." Opal had pressed her ear harder against the wall, her small heart hammering as the adults who had been her whole world discussed her fate like she was livestock to be sold. "She's got that Apache look about her anyway," Silas had continued, his voice growing harder. "Folks in town been commenting on her dark hair, her skin that won't stay pale no matter how much time she spends indoors. Maybe she'd be better off with her own kind." That was when Opal learned the truth she had sensed but never understood. Her real parents, killed in an Apache raid when she was barely 3, had not both been white settlers as she'd been told. Her mother had been Apache, taken as a child and raised by missionaries. Her father, a white trader who had loved her despite the scandal it caused. Their union had created Opal, a child caught between 2 worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. The memory of that revelation mixed with her current hunger and thirst, making her stomach clench with more than just physical need. She had always wondered why her reflection looked different from the Crawfords', why her hair fell straight and black while theirs curled in brown waves, why her eyes held depths that seemed older than her 6 years high above. Dezba shifted his. He waited and studied the child more carefully. Even from this distance, he could see the telltale signs, the straight black hair, the golden tone of her skin, the way she held herself with a kind of natural grace that reminded him painfully of his own people. This was not purely a white child, though her clothing and the English words she sobbed suggested she had been raised in the settler world. His mind drifted back to his own childhood, when his grandfather Naalnish had told him stories of children, caught between peoples, neither fully accepted by one side nor the other. "These little ones carry special medicine," the old man had said, his ancient voice crackling like a dying fire. "They are bridges between worlds, if they can survive long enough to understand their purpose." Dezba fingered the medicine pouch again, feeling the carved horse press against his palm. 3 years ago, he had been a different man, a husband, a father, a respected warrior in Chief Victorio's band. He had believed in the old ways, the sacred traditions that taught his people to live in harmony with the desert and its creatures. But harmony had proved impossible when the blue soldiers came with their endless hunger for Apache land. The raid that took his family had been swift and brutal. Captain Reynolds, the officer in charge, had claimed they were pursuing hostiles who had attacked a supply wagon. But Dezba knew the truth. His band had been peaceful, camped near the agreed-upon reservation boundaries, causing no trouble. The attack had been about intimidation, about showing the Apache that nowhere was truly safe from the reach of the territorial government. He had returned from a hunting trip to find his world destroyed. Itzel lay crumpled near their wickiup, 3 bullet wounds in her chest. But Ayella had simply vanished. No body, no trace except for tiny moccasin prints leading toward the soldiers' horses before disappearing in the chaos of hoof prints and blood. For months, Dezba had searched. He had ridden to every fort, every settlement, looking for any sign of his daughter. Some said captured Apache children were sent east to boarding schools. Others whispered of adoption by white families who wanted to civilize Indian youngsters. But the trail had gone cold, and eventually even Chief Victorio had counseled him to accept that Ayella walked the spirit trail now. But acceptance and healing were different things entirely. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance brought Dezba's attention back to the present danger. A cavalry patrol, probably the same one that had been harassing Apache camps for the past month, was approaching from the east. He counted 6 horses, which meant 6 soldiers armed with carbines and sidearms. The child below seemed oblivious to the approaching threat, lost in her own world of abandonment and fear. Dezba faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. His warrior training told him to fade back into the rocks, to avoid any contact with whites that might compromise his band's location. Chief Victorio's explicit orders were to stay hidden, to avoid provocation while they prepared for their next move deeper into the mountains. But as he looked down at the sobbing child, he saw not just another white settler's offspring, but something else entirely. He saw Ayella's face in her profile, heard his daughter's cries in her weeping. Most importantly, he saw a child who would die of thirst and exposure within days if someone didn't help her. The medicine pouch seemed to grow warm against his chest, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice whispering across the years. Sometimes the spirits put a choice before us that tests everything we believe about honor and compassion. These moments reveal who we truly are. Down below, Opal had grown quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Her tears had dried, leaving salt tracks on her dusty cheeks. She stared at her torn blue dress, the same dress Martha Crawford had sewn for her last Christmas, decorated with tiny flowers that had once made her feel pretty and loved. Now it hung in tatters, a symbol of everything she had lost. The hoofbeats were getting closer, and Dezba made his decision. Moving with the fluid silence that had made him legendary among his people, he began his descent toward the bridge. Each step was calculated, each placement of his moccasined feet, chosen to avoid loose stones that might betray his approach. He carried his rifle slung across his back, but his hands remained empty and visible, a gesture of peaceful intent that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. As he reached the bottom of the slope, Opal looked up with wide, frightened eyes. She had never seen an Apache warrior up close, but she recognized immediately what he was from the stories Uncle Silas used to tell around the fire. The long, black hair bound with leather, the buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, the weathered face that seemed carved from the desert stone itself. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The abandoned child and the grieving warrior, two souls wounded by the same harsh world that seemed to offer no mercy to those caught in its conflicts. Neither spoke, but something passed between them in that silence, a recognition that transcended language and culture. Dezba slowly reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew the small carved horse. Without words, he extended his hand toward Opal, offering the toy that had been his most precious possession, the last tangible connection to his lost daughter. The hoofbeats were very close now, and both the man and child could hear the jangle of cavalry equipment, the rough voices of soldiers scanning the terrain for signs of Apache presence. In moments, they would round the bend and discover this impossible scene, an Apache warrior offering comfort to an abandoned white child. But in that instant, before the world intruded again, Opal made her own choice. She reached out with trembling fingers and accepted the gift, closing her small hand around the carved horse as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning swimmer. Neither of them knew it yet, but this simple exchange would set in motion events that would challenge every assumption about loyalty, family, and survival in the unforgiving territory of 1870s Arizona. The child who had been thrown away by her own kind and the warrior who had lost everything to the white man's war had found each other at the exact moment when both needed salvation. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Dezba gestured urgently for Opal to remain quiet. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The cavalry patrol rounded the bend just as Dezba pressed himself and Opal against the stone supports of the bridge. Lieutenant Morrison, a young officer with ambitious eyes and a carefully waxed mustache, rode at the head of the column, his gaze sweeping the landscape with the practiced intensity of a man hunting prey. "Sergeant Davis, have the men spread out and check those rocks," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "The Apache sign we've been following leads right through this area." Opal's eyes went wide with terror as she heard the jingling of spurs and the creak of leather. She had heard enough stories about Apache raids and cavalry battles to understand that discovery meant death, either from the soldiers who would assume she had been captured or from being caught in whatever violence might erupt between the Sadhu. Two forces. Dezba placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that somehow conveyed both warning and reassurance. He brought his finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, and remarkably, the frightened child seemed to understand that her life now depended on absolute stillness. The wooden horse remained clutched in her small fist, and she found herself focusing on its smooth surface, using it as an anchor against the waves of fear washing over her. There was something about the toy that felt familiar, though she couldn't name what it was. The careful craftsmanship, the way it had been, worn smooth by loving hands, suggested it had been treasured by someone who cared deeply about its creation. "Sir, I'm seeing tracks here," called out Private Henderson, a stocky man with prematurely grey hair who served as the patrol's tracker. "Unshod pony prints, maybe 2 days old, heading north toward the dragoons." Morrison dismounted and examined the ground where Henderson pointed. "Just one horse." "Appears so, sir. Light rider, moving fast. Could be a scout." Dezba's jaw tightened as he listened to the exchange. These soldiers were tracking his movements from his last reconnaissance mission, when he had ridden out to assess the military buildup around Fort Buchanan. If they followed that trail, it would lead them uncomfortably close to where Chief Victorio's band was currently camped. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, hiding beneath a bridge to protect a child who was part white, while soldiers hunted him for the crime of trying to protect his own people from further encroachment. The circular nature of the conflict seemed to mock any possibility of peace between the two peoples. "What about water sources in this area?" Morrison asked, pulling out a hand-drawn map of the territory. "If there are Apaches moving through here, they'll need to drink somewhere." "There's a spring about 3 miles north, sir," replied Corporal Williams, a lean man with sun-weathered features. "And this old bridge here crosses what used to be a creek bed. Might still have water after the summer rains." Morrison's gaze shifted toward their hiding spot, and for a heart-stopping moment, Opal thought they had been discovered. But the lieutenant was studying the bridge structure itself, not looking for concealed figures beneath it. Decent defensive. "Position," he mused aloud. "Stone construction, good sight lines in all directions. If I were planning an ambush, this would be an ideal spot." The soldiers began a more systematic search of the area, and Dezba realized they would be discovered within minutes unless he acted. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, but then he glanced at Opal and knew that violence would only ensure her death as well as his own. 6 armed cavalry soldiers were more than even his considerable skills could handle while protecting a child. Instead, he made a decision that went against every warrior instinct he possessed. Placing his lips close to Opal's ear, he whispered in barely audible English, "When I move, you stay. No sound, no movement, safe here." She nodded, though her grip on the carved horse tightened until her knuckles showed white beneath her sun-darkened skin. Dezba began to ease himself away from the bridge support, moving with the liquid grace of a man who had spent his entire life, learning to become one with the landscape. His plan was simple but dangerous: create a distraction that would draw the soldiers away from Opal's hiding spot while giving himself a chance to escape. But as he prepared to reveal himself, fate intervened. "In an unexpected way, Lieutenant Morrison, sir." The call came from Private Henderson, who had been examining the ground near the creek bed. "You need to see this." The officer approached the tracker, who was kneeling beside what appeared to be a small pile of stones. "What is it, Henderson?" "Child's footprints, sir. Small ones wearing shoes, not moccasins. And look here, pieces of torn fabric caught on this mesquite bush." Morrison knelt beside his tracker and examined the evidence. The fabric was blue cotton, clearly from a white child's dress. The footprints, though partially obscured by wind and time, were unmistakably those of a young child who'd been walking unsteadily, possibly injured or exhausted. "Apache raiders took a child," Morrison concluded grimly, "probably from one of the outlying farms. The question is whether they've killed her already or are keeping her for some reason." Dezba felt his blood run cold as he realized the soldiers had drawn exactly the wrong conclusion from the evidence. They believed Opal had been captured by Apaches, not abandoned by her own people. This misunderstanding would make her rescue infinitely more complicated. "Could still be alive, sir," suggested Sergeant Davis, a grizzled veteran with scars from previous Indian campaigns. "Sometimes they keep the young ones, try to raise them as their own, or use them as bargaining chips," Morrison added darkly. "Either way, we have a responsibility to pursue. If there's even a chance she's alive, we need to track down whoever took her." From her hiding place, Opal listened to this conversation with growing confusion and fear. The soldiers thought she had been captured, but she knew the truth. She had been abandoned by the only family she had known. Now these men were preparing to hunt the very person who had shown her kindness in her darkest hour. The injustice of it sparked something fierce in her 6-year-old heart. For the first time since being left under the bridge, she felt anger alongside her fear and grief. These soldiers, supposedly the protectors of people like her, were so quick to assume the worst about the Apache warrior who had offered her his most precious possession. Morrison stood and brushed dust from his knees. "Mount up, men. We're following this trail north. If there are Apaches in the area with a captive child, we need to find them before they disappear into the mountains." As the soldiers prepared to leave, one final cruel twist of fate occurred. Private Henderson, making a last sweep of the area, happened to glance down at the exact spot where Opal was hiding. For a frozen moment, their eyes met across the shadowy space beneath the bridge. The soldier's mouth opened to call out to his lieutenant, but something in the child's expression stopped him. Instead of the wild fear he might expect from a recently captured prisoner, he saw a kind of desperate pleading, as if she were begging him not to reveal her presence. Henderson was a father himself, with 2 daughters back in Missouri, and something about this scene didn't match his expectations. But before he could process what he was seeing, Opal pressed deeper into the shadows and seemed to vanish entirely, her small form blending with the stone and darkness. The private blinked, wondering if exhaustion and desert heat had caused him to see things that weren't there. After a moment's hesitation, he turned away and rejoined his unit without saying anything. As the cavalry patrol rode north, following a trail they thought would lead them to Apache raiders and their captive, Dezba emerged from his own hiding spot and approached Opal. She was trembling now, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of how complicated her situation had become. "They think," she began in a whisper, but Dezba gently placed his finger to his lips again. He understood. The soldiers believed she had been taken by Apache warriors, which meant they would hunt any Apache they found with deadly determination. His presence here with her would seem to confirm their worst assumptions, making them both targets of a military force that showed little mercy in its campaigns against his people. But there was no going back now. The choice had been made the moment he climbed down from that ridge and offered her the carved horse. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. Taking Opal's hand in his weathered palm, Dezba began to lead her away from the bridge, heading toward the rocky hills where ancient caves had sheltered his ancestors for generations. Behind them, the hoofbeats of the cavalry patrol faded into the distance, but both the warrior and the child knew this was only the beginning of their troubles. The wooden horse remained clutched tightly in Opal's free hand, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most unlikely people become family when the rest of the world fails you. The cave system Dezba led them to had been carved by wind and water over countless centuries, creating a hidden sanctuary deep within the red sandstone cliffs. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, spirals and handprints left by his ancestors, who had sought shelter in these same chambers generations before the white men ever set foot in Apache territory. Opal followed close behind him, her small legs working hard to match his stride as they climbed the narrow trail that led to the cave entrance. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself fascinated by how Dezba moved, each step placed with deliberate care, never disturbing loose stones that might give away their passage, always aware of what lay ahead and behind them. The entrance was so cleverly concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines and weathered rock that she would have walked past it without ever knowing it existed. But Dezba parted the vegetation with practiced ease and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that surprised her given everything Uncle Silas had told her about savage Apache customs. Inside, the cave opened into a spacious chamber lit by shafts of sunlight filtering through natural skylights in the rock above. The air was cool and dry, a blessed relief from the oppressive desert heat, and somewhere in the depths she could hear the gentle sound of dripping water. "Safe," Dezba said in careful English, the first word he had spoken aloud since their encounter. At the bridge, His voice was deep and measured, carrying an accent that transformed the familiar English sounds in interesting ways. Opal nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed safety existed anywhere in her world anymore. Still, the cave felt protected, secret, like a place where the terrible things that had happened over the past 2 days might not be able to find her. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she began to notice details that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had used this place for shelter. A ring of stones marked an old fire pit, and niches in the walls held various supplies, water gourds, bundles of dried food, extra weapons, and tools wrapped in oiled leather. Near one wall, she spotted something that made her heart skip. A leather-bound book with a torn cover, half hidden, beneath a pile of trade blankets. Moving closer, she recognized it as the Crawford family Bible, the same one Martha used to read from during their evening prayers. How it had ended up here, she couldn't imagine, but seeing it felt like finding a piece of her former life in this strange new world. Dezba noticed her interest and followed her gaze to the Bible. His expression grew thoughtful as he realized what it meant to her. Moving to the book, he carefully extracted it from the blankets and held it out to her. "Yours?" he asked in that same careful English. She nodded, accepting the familiar weight of the Bible with trembling hands. Inside the front cover, written in Martha's careful script, were the family records, births, deaths, marriages spanning 3 generations of Crawfords. Her own name appeared on the last page, Opal Marie Crawford, taken into our care July 15th, 1871, orphaned by Apache raid near Tucson. The irony of those words struck her with fresh pain. Apache raid. Here she was, being protected by an Apache warrior, while her own white family had abandoned her to die. The simple categories of good and evil that had once made sense in her child's understanding of the world were crumbling around her. Dezba watched her reaction with growing understanding. This child was not just physically lost, she was caught between 2 peoples who had been taught to hate each other, belonging fully to neither world. It was a situation he recognized all too well from his own experience of loving a woman who had been raised by white missionaries. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew a piece of dried meat and a small gourd of water, offering both to Opal with gestures that needed no translation. She accepted gratefully, suddenly aware of how empty her stomach felt and how dry her mouth had become. As she ate, Dezba began to speak in a mixture of Apache and English, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone telling an important story. Though she couldn't understand all the words, she caught enough to realize he was talking about his own daughter. "Ayella," he said several times, and each time his voice grew softer with remembered love. He showed her how to conserve the water, taking small sips rather than gulping it down, and demonstrated which plants growing near the cave entrance could be eaten safely. When she seemed confused by his instructions, he would repeat the Apache words slowly, then follow them with English translations when he knew them. "Water. 2, he said, holding up the gourd. "Food. Chiyan. Safe. Du yinda da," Opal found herself repeating the Apache words, her young tongue adapting quickly to the unfamiliar sounds. Each new word felt like a small bridge being built between them, a way to communicate beyond the barrier of language that divided their peoples. But even as she began to feel a tentative sense of security in the hidden cave, the reality of their situation pressed in around them. Through the cave entrance, they could see smoke rising in the distance, not the thin grey smoke of cooking fires, but the thick black columns that meant buildings were burning. The cavalry patrol wasn't just searching for sign of Apache presence. They were actively destroying anything they found. Dezba stood at the cave mouth, studying the smoke with grim recognition. He had seen too many peaceful Apache camps reduced to ash and bones to mistake what was happening out there. The soldiers were following their usual pattern: burn first, ask questions later, and justify the destruction by claiming they were pursuing hostiles. The knowledge that his own band might be in danger created a terrible conflict within him. Chief Victorio was depending on his scouts to bring word of military movements, and here he was, trapped in a cave, with a white child, while his people faced potential destruction. But when he looked back at Opal, still clutching both the carved horse and the family Bible like talismans against an uncertain future, he knew he couldn't abandon her. She had already been thrown away once by people who claimed to love her. He would not be the second adult to fail her when she needed protection most. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Dezba made a decision that would define the rest of their journey together. Moving to his supply cache, he withdrew a small bundle of soft deerskin and began cutting it into pieces with his knife. "For your feet," he explained in English, gesturing toward Opal's torn shoes. Desert hard walking, working with the skill of a man who had crafted countless items for his own daughter, he began to fashion a pair of simple moccasins sized for Opal's small feet. Each stitch was placed with care, each piece of leather shaped to provide maximum comfort and protection. As she watched him work by the fading light, Opal realized something that would have shocked her just days ago. She felt safer with this Apache warrior than she had with any of the white adults who had controlled her life. He asked nothing of her except to survive, offered no false promises about easy solutions, but provided exactly what she needed most. Someone who wouldn't abandon her when caring for her became difficult. Outside the cave, the smoke continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Their sanctuary was secure for now, but both of them understood that the larger world was growing more dangerous with each passing hour. The nightmares came with the darkness. Opal woke gasping, her small body drenched in sweat despite the cave's cool air. In her dreams, she had been running through endless corridors of stone, while voices called her name. First Martha's gentle tones, then Uncle Silas's rougher baritone. But when she turned toward the sounds, the speakers dissolved into smoke and shadow, leaving her more alone than ever. Across the cave, Dezba sat cross-legged near the dying embers of their small fire, his war paint pot open beside him. The red ochre and charcoal within had been mixed with sacred water from the hidden spring, creating the pigments his people had used for generations to prepare for battle or ceremony. But tonight, instead of painting symbols of war on his face, he was carefully decorating the wooden horse Opal had returned to him before sleeping. The toy had belonged to Ayella, crafted during the long winter months when his daughter would sit beside him and chatter about everything and nothing while he worked. Now, as he added delicate patterns in red and black, symbols of protection and courage, he felt his lost daughter's presence hovering at the edges of his consciousness. "Bad dreams?" he asked softly in English, when he noticed Opal was awake. She nodded, drawing her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. The new moccasins he had made for her were comfortable and warm, but they couldn't protect her from the fears that stalked her sleep. "I kept hearing voices calling me, but when I tried to find them, nobody was there," she whispered. "And there were soldiers with guns, chasing me through dark places where I couldn't see." Dezba set down his painting tools and moved closer to where she sat huddled against the cave wall. Without speaking, he began to share the foods he had gathered. That evening, pine nuts and cactus fruit, the sweet flesh of a barrel cactus he had carefully harvested after the sun went down. Each bite was a small lesson in survival, though he couched it in gentleness rather than harsh instruction. In Apache, "Way," he said slowly, choosing his English words with care. "Bad dreams come when spirit is fighting to understand new path." She looked at him with those dark eyes that reminded him so painfully of Ayella, and he saw in them the same struggle his own daughter had faced when learning to navigate the complexities of a world that seemed determined to crush the innocent. "My grandfather," he continued, "taught me that dreams show us what we fear most, but also what we must become strong enough to face. As he spoke, Opal found herself studying his weathered features in the firelight. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against desert sun and wind, but also of laughter shared with people he had loved. Scars marked his hands and arms, some from battles, others from the countless small injuries that came from a life lived close to the harsh realities of survival. "Tell me about Ayella," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. The request hit Dezba like a physical blow, but after a moment's hesitation he began to speak. The words came slowly at first, mixing Apache and English as he struggled to convey the depth of his love for his lost daughter. She was, like you, curious about everything, always asking questions. Why do coyotes sing at night? Why do flowers bloom in different colors? Why do some people have hearts full of anger, while others have hearts full of kindness? His voice grew softer as the memories took hold. She would sit with me when I worked, making up stories about the horses I carved. Each one had a name, a personality, a special power to help children who were afraid or lost. Opal listened with growing fascination as Dezba painted a picture of a little girl who sounded remarkably like herself. Inquisitive, imaginative, caught between the adult world's harsh realities and a child's natural wonder about life's mysteries. "What happened to her?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would be painful. Dezba, hands stilled as he struggled with how much truth a 6-year-old could bear. Finally, he settled on a version that honored Ayella's memory, without overwhelming Opal with details she wasn't ready to process. "Soldiers came to our camp one morning. Many people were hurt. Ayella was taken away, and I never saw her again." His fingers traced the patterns he had painted on the wooden horse. "For 3 years, I looked for her, everywhere. But sometimes, when people we love are taken from us, we never find them in this world again." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep in Opal's heart. Here was an adult who understood loss in a way the Crawfords never had, who didn't try to cushion painful truths with false comfort or empty promises that everything would work out fine. "Do you think she's dead?" Opal asked, her child's directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "I don't know," Dezba admitted, "but I believe her spirit is still strong somewhere. And I believe she would want me to help other children who need protection the way I couldn't protect her." As if to illustrate his point, he handed the newly decorated wooden horse back to Opal. The red and black symbols he had painted on its surface seemed to glow in the firelight, transforming the simple toy into something that felt magical and powerful. "This was hers, but now it's yours," he said. "Ayella's spirit lives in it, and she will help you be brave when you need to be brave, smart when you need to be smart." Opal accepted the gift with a reverence that showed she understood its significance. This wasn't just a toy. It was a sacred trust, a connection between her and a little girl she would never meet, but who had somehow prepared the way for her survival. Outside the cave, the sounds of the desert night provided a gentle symphony. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through brush, the whisper of wind through stone passages worn smooth by centuries of weathering. But underlying these peaceful sounds was something more ominous. The faint echo of hoofbeats and the occasional glint of torch flames moving through the darkness. The cavalry patrol had returned, and this time they were conducting a night search, systematically checking every possible hiding place in their determination to find the captured child and her Apache captors. Dezba heard the signs before Opal did, his warrior senses alert to any change in the natural rhythm of the night. Moving to the cave entrance, he peered through the concealing vegetation and saw torchlights moving in a grid pattern across the desert floor below. They would have to move again, and soon. This sanctuary that had given them both a chance to begin trusting each other, was about to become a trap. But as he watched Opal clutch the wooden horse to her chest and finally drift back into peaceful sleep, Dezba realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. They were no longer just a warrior and a lost child thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming a family, bound together by shared loss and the fierce determination to protect each other from a world that seemed determined to destroy them both. 3 days had passed since they fled the cave, and Opal was discovering muscles she never knew she possessed. The desert terrain that had seemed impossibly harsh from the comfort of the Crawford farmhouse revealed itself to be a complex ecosystem of hidden life and ancient wisdom when viewed through Dezba's eyes. He taught her to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving landscape, how the flight pattern of ravens could lead them to water, how the angle of certain rock formations provided shelter from both sun and wind, how the behavior of lizards and insects warned of approaching storms or dangers. "Everything speaks," he told her, as they rested in the shade of a towering saguaro. Cactus, its arms reaching toward the sky like a giant's embrace. Desert tells stories to those who know how to listen. Opal found herself absorbing these lessons with an intensity that surprised them both. Her Apache heritage, long suppressed by years of living in the white world, seemed to awaken in response to Dezba's teaching. Words in his language came easily to her tongue, as if she had been born knowing them and had simply forgotten until now. But their peaceful education was interrupted that afternoon by the arrival of Nietzsche, a young Apache scout whose painted face and urgent manner announced trouble long before he spoke a word. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, but Opal understood enough by now to catch the essential meaning. Cavalry forces were closing in on Chief Victorio's main band, and there was pressure from some quarters to surrender Dezba and the white child to avoid further conflict. She watched Dezba's face grow grave as Nietzsche delivered his message and saw the internal struggle playing out behind his dark eyes. The eagle feather that marked his status as a respected warrior, a symbol of leadership earned in battle against overwhelming odds, seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders as he considered his response. "What does he want?" Opal asked when Nietzsche had finished speaking. Dezba was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much of the truth to share with her. Finally, he knelt beside her and spoke with the careful honesty that had become his way of treating her not as a child to be protected from reality, but as a partner in their survival. "My people are afraid," he said. "Soldiers are coming closer every day. Some think if they give you back to the white men, the fighting will stop." The words hit Opal like a physical blow. After finally finding someone who wouldn't abandon her, she was facing the possibility of being traded away like a piece of livestock to appease political necessities she couldn't understand. "But you won't let them, will you?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "You won't give me back to people who don't want me?" The trust in her question broke something open in Dezba's chest. Here was a child who had been failed by every adult authority figure in her young life, yet she still had the courage to believe that he might be different. "No," he said firmly, his hand coming to rest on the eagle feather that marked his warrior status. "I will not give you to anyone who does not love you the way a child deserves to be loved." The declaration seemed to surprise Nietzsche, who launched into another rapid exchange in Apache. From his gestures and tone, it was clear he was arguing for practicality over sentiment, pointing out the dangers that Dezba's choice would bring down on all their heads. But Dezba's response was calm and unwavering. He spoke of honor, of the sacred duty to protect the innocent, of the teachings of their grandfathers, who had always valued courage over convenience. When he finished, he removed the eagle feather from his hair and held it up to catch the afternoon sunlight. "This feather was given to me for bravery in battle," he told Nietzsche in English, ensuring that Opal could understand his words. "But true, Bravery is not just fighting enemies with weapons. Sometimes it means protecting one small person when the whole world says you should walk away. Nietzsche shook his head, clearly disagreeing with Dezba's choice, but he made no further argument. With a final warning about cavalry movements in the area, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving them alone with the weight of their decision. That evening, as they made camp in a sheltered arroyo miles from any traveled path, Opal surprised Dezba by asking about Chief Victorio and the political situation that was making their lives so complicated. "Why do your people and my people, the white people, fight so much?" she asked, her child's directness cutting through layers of adult rationalization to reach the heart of the matter. Dezba considered the question while he prepared their simple meal of roasted pine nuts and cactus fruit. How could he explain centuries of misunderstanding, broken treaties, and cultural clash to a 6-year-old who had experienced the worst of both worlds? "Long time ago," he began slowly, "Apache people lived here alone. We knew every rock, every plant, every animal. We took only what we needed, and we gave thanks for everything the desert provided." He gestured toward the vast landscape around them, painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun. Then white people came, and they saw the land differently. They wanted to own it, change it, make it look like the places they came from far away. They didn't understand that the desert was already perfect, already home to people who loved it. Opal nodded, beginning to grasp the fundamental difference in worldview that lay beneath all the violence and mistrust. Both sides got scared. Dezba continued. "Scared people do cruel things, hurt innocent people who never did anything wrong. Your parents died because some Apache warriors were angry and afraid. My wife and daughter died because some white soldiers were angry and afraid." The simple explanation carried more weight than any complex political analysis could have managed. Fear driving people to hurt each other, with children like Opal and Ayella caught in the crossfire of adult failures. "So, what happens now?" Opal asked, unconsciously echoing the question that kept Dezba awake during the long desert nights. "Now we try to be braver than our fear," he replied. "We try to show that Apache and white people can care for each other, can be family even when the rest of the world says it's impossible." As if to seal the promise, he began teaching her to identify the constellations that Apache travelers had, used for navigation for countless generations. Each star pattern had a story, a lesson about courage or wisdom, or the importance of remembering where you came from, even when the journey took you far from home. But even as they shared this peaceful moment, both of them were aware that their private world of mutual care and learning was under constant threat. Captain Reynolds and his cavalry forces were still hunting them, convinced they were tracking Apache raiders and their captive. Chief Victorio's band was facing pressure to surrender them to avoid further military retaliation. Time was running out for their unlikely family, and soon they would have to face the larger world that seemed determined to tear them apart. A week had transformed Opal in ways that would have amazed anyone who had known her during her sheltered life with the Crawfords. Her hands, once soft from indoor work and gentle play, now bore the honest calluses of desert survival. The makeshift Apache moccasins Dezba had crafted for her had molded to her feet like a second skin, allowing her to move across rocky terrain with a grace that would have been impossible in her former life's proper shoes. More importantly, her spirit was changing. The terrified, abandoned child who had wept beneath the stone bridge was evolving into someone stronger, someone who understood that survival wasn't just about finding food and water. It was about finding the courage to keep moving forward when everything familiar had been stripped away. But that transformation was about to be tested in ways neither she nor Dezba could have anticipated. The cavalry patrol that found them that morning approached with unusual stealth, using tactics that suggested they had learned from their previous failures to locate their quarry. Captain Reynolds himself led this group, his ambitious eyes scanning the landscape with the focused intensity of a man who saw promotion and glory within his grasp. Dezba spotted them first, his warrior instincts alerting him to the wrongness. In the desert's natural rhythm, the birds had gone silent, and the small creatures that usually rustled through the brush at dawn had vanished into hiding. These were the signs that had kept his ancestors alive for generations, and they spoke clearly of approaching danger. "Soldiers," he whispered to Opal, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt, many of them, moving careful, like hunters. They were camped in a shallow depression, surrounded by desert ironwood and palo verde trees, vegetation that provided excellent concealment but also created the potential for a trap if they were discovered. The nearest escape route led uphill through exposed terrain, where they would be sitting targets for cavalry carbines. "What do we do?" Opal asked, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her dark eyes. The weeks of survival training had taught her to think tactically, even in moments of crisis. Dezba studied their options with the calculating mind that had made him legendary among his people. The soldiers were approaching from 3 directions, clearly intending to surround their position before closing in for the capture. Traditional Apache tactics called for melting away before the enemy could establish their trap, but with a child to protect, his mobility was severely limited. "We separate," he decided, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "You hide in the ironwood thicket, small spaces where horses cannot go. I lead them away." The plan was tactically sound, but emotionally devastating. After weeks of building trust and family bonds, he was asking her to watch him ride away, potentially forever. For a child who had already been abandoned once, the psychological trauma of another separation might be more damaging than any physical danger. "No," Opal said firmly, surprising them both with the strength in her voice. "We stay together. That's what families do." Her declaration of loyalty touched something profound in Dezba's warrior heart, but it also highlighted the impossible nature of their situation. Staying together meant almost certain capture. Separating meant destroying the trust that had become the foundation of both their healing. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made the decision for them. Captain Reynolds and his men had spotted their camp and were closing in fast, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed desert floor like war drums, announcing the end of their freedom. "There!" Reynolds shouted, pointing directly at their position. "The Apache and his captive! Surround them before they can escape." The next few minutes unfolded with the chaotic intensity of a desert thunderstorm. Dezba grabbed Opal's hand and ran toward the thickest part of the ironwood grove, hoping the tangled branches would slow the mounted soldiers enough to give them a chance to find better cover. But as they crashed through the undergrowth, Opal's foot caught on a hidden root, sending her tumbling to the ground with a cry of pain and fear. In that moment of vulnerability, as Dezba turned back to help her up, Captain Reynolds appeared through the trees with his sidearm drawn. "Don't move, Apache," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Step away from the child and put your hands where I can see them." Dezba found himself facing the nightmare scenario he had tried so hard to avoid. With Opal injured and soldiers surrounding their position, his options had dwindled to nothing. Any aggressive move would likely result in gunfire that could kill the child he had sworn to protect. But, as he raised his hands in apparent surrender, Opal surprised everyone by struggling to her feet and placing herself between Dezba and the cavalry officer. "He didn't capture me," she shouted in English, her young voice carrying across the desert with startling clarity. "He saved me. My own family left me to die, and he's the only one who cared enough to help." Captain Reynolds's certainty wavered for a moment as he processed this unexpected declaration. His intelligence reports had been clear. Apache raiders had taken a white child, probably for ransom, or to raise as one of their own. The idea that the child might have been willingly with her supposed captor had never occurred to him. "You're confused, child," he said, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "You've been held captive so long, you don't understand what's happening to you. But you're safe now. We're here to take you home." "This is my home," Opal replied, gesturing toward Dezba with fierce loyalty. "He's my family now. The people who were supposed to take care of me threw me away like garbage, but he taught me how to survive, how to be brave, how to find food and water, and read the signs that keep you alive in the desert." The passion in her voice carried a truth that even the most skeptical soldier could recognize. This was not the desperate plea of a captive trying to avoid punishment for her captor. This was the fierce defense of someone she genuinely loved and trusted. Captain Reynolds found himself in an unexpected position. His entire military operation had been based on the assumption that he was rescuing a kidnapped child from savage raiders. But the evidence of his own eyes suggested a far more complicated situation, one that didn't fit neatly into the categories of victim and villain that had guided his actions. "Even if that's true," he said finally, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand near the grip, "you're still a white child who belongs with white people. The territorial governor has put a substantial bounty on your safe return." The mention of official interest made Dezba's blood run cold. This was no longer just about one overzealous cavalry officer. They were dealing with political forces that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. The stakes had just become far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But as he looked down at Opal, standing protectively in front of him despite her injured ankle, he realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. She was no longer just a child he was protecting. She had become a full partner in their survival, someone whose courage and loyalty matched his own. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as the family they had chosen to become despite every force arrayed against them. The Apache scout who stumbled into their temporary camp 3 days later was more dead than alive, his body riddled with bullet wounds and his breathing shallow and labored. Ayella had clearly ridden hard through the night, pushing his wounded horse to the breaking point to deliver information that couldn't wait for a more convenient moment. Dezba immediately began tending to the scout's injuries, while Opal fetched water from their hidden spring, both of them working with the quiet efficiency that had developed during their weeks together. But even as they tried to save Ayyella's life, his urgent whispers in Apache made it clear that his mission was more important than his survival. "What is he saying?" Opal asked, recognizing the urgency in the dying man's voice, even though she couldn't understand all the words. Dezba's face had gone ashen as he listened to Ayyella's report, and when he finally looked up at Opal, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, a deep, cold fear that went beyond anything they had faced together. "Tell me," she said quietly, her own voice steady despite the dread that was building in her chest. For a long moment, Dezba struggled with how to share information that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Finally, he took her small hands in his weathered ones and spoke with the careful honesty that had become their way of facing difficult truths together. "You are not just any white child," he said slowly. "Your real name is not Opal Crawford. Your father was Jonathan Hartwell, the territorial governor's younger brother. Your mother was Paloma, an Apache woman who had been educated at the mission school in Tucson." The words hit Opal like physical blows, each revelation shattering another piece of the identity she had constructed for herself over the past months. Everything she thought she knew about her origins, her family, her place in the world had been built on lies. "The Crawfords never told you the truth about your parents because they were afraid," Dezba continued. "Your father was killed for loving an Apache woman. Your mother was killed for loving a white man. The people who hated their union wanted you dead too, so the Crawfords hid you, gave you a new name, tried to make you disappear into their world." As the full implications of this revelation sank in, Opal realized why the cavalry's pursuit had been so relentless. why Captain Reynolds had seemed so determined to capture her alive. She wasn't just any abandoned child. She was the niece of the territorial governor, a living symbol of the racial mixing that both sides of the conflict viewed as either forbidden or dangerous. Lieutenant Morrison's dispatch case, which Ayella had managed to steal during his escape from the cavalry camp, contained orders that confirmed the worst of their fears. The territorial government had indeed put a massive bounty on Opal's safe return, but not for the reasons they had assumed. "They want to use you," Dezba explained after reading through the official documents with growing horror. "Your uncle, the governor, he plans to put you in a boarding school back east, somewhere far away, where no one will ever know about your Apache blood. He wants to erase that part of you completely, make you into a proper white lady who can never remind people that his family mixed with Indians." But the documents revealed an even more sinister plan. If Opal couldn't be civilized according to white standards, if her Apache heritage proved too strong to suppress, the orders gave Captain Reynolds discretionary authority to ensure that she never became a public embarrassment to the governor's political career. The phrase, "by any means necessary," appeared several times in the correspondence, and its implications were clear to anyone who understood the brutal realities of territorial politics. "They're not trying to rescue me," Opal said, her young voice carrying a wisdom that should have been impossible at her age. "They're trying to erase me, just like the Crawfords did when they hid who I really was." The magnitude of the conspiracy against her was staggering. White society wanted to eliminate her Apache heritage, while some factions within the Apache community saw her mixed blood as a contamination to be avoided. She was a living reminder of a love story that both sides preferred to forget, a child whose very existence challenged the racial boundaries that kept the two peoples locked in their cycle of violence and mistrust. But as devastating as these revelations were, they also provided a kind of liberation. For the first time in her young life, Opal understood exactly who she was and why she had never felt like she truly belonged in either world. She was Paloma and Jonathan's daughter, the product of a love that had defied convention and paid the ultimate price for that defiance. "My real name," she said slowly, testing the words like a prayer. "What was my real name before the Crawfords changed it?" Dezba's expression softened as he shared the final piece of her true identity. "Ayana," he said. "Your name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom in Apache." The irony was almost overwhelming. All this time, he had been protecting a child whose Apache name was so close to his own daughter's that fate seemed to be mocking his pain. Ayana and Ayella, two little girls whose lives had been shaped by the same forces of hatred and fear that had torn the territory apart for decades. As Ayella's breathing grew more labored, he managed one final warning through blood-flecked lips. Captain Reynolds had made an alliance with a group of Apache dissidents led by a warrior named Geronimo's lieutenant, who believed that trading Opal to the whites would buy peace for their people. The cavalry officer had promised weapons and safe passage to Mexico in exchange for their help in capturing the girl and eliminating Dezba as a witness to their cooperation. The betrayal cut deep, but it also clarified their situation with brutal honesty. They were now hunted by both sides, with nowhere to turn for sanctuary except to each other and the ancient wisdom that had sustained Apache survivors for generations. But the most shocking revelation came in Ayella's final moments, when he pressed a small leather pouch into Dezba's hands with trembling fingers. Inside the pouch was a single item that changed everything, a photograph of a young Apache woman and a white man standing together in formal dress outside a small church. On the back, written in careful script, were the words, "Jonathan and Paloma Hartwell. Married June 15, 1868. May love conquer all the hatred in this world." The woman in the photograph bore an unmistakable resemblance to both Opal and Dezba's lost daughter Ayella. But more shocking still was the realization that Dezba recognized the woman. She was his sister-in-law, his wife Itzel's younger sister, who had disappeared years ago after being taken by missionaries. Opal wasn't just any Apache child. She was family, connected to him by bonds of blood that went deeper than the choice he had made to protect her. Paloma had been Itzel's sister, which made Opal his niece by marriage, Ayella's cousin by blood. The revelation recontextualized everything. His instant recognition of something familiar in her face, her natural aptitude for Apache language and customs, the sense of rightness he had felt in protecting her, despite the enormous risks involved. As Naiche breathed his last, surrounded by the two people he had risked everything to warn, Dezba and Opal found themselves staring at each other with new understanding. They were not just chosen family, they were blood family, united by ties that had been hidden but never truly broken. The political forces arrayed against them were vast and implacable, but they now had something even more powerful. The absolute certainty that they belonged together, that their bond was sanctified by both love and kinship, and that no earthly authority had the right to separate them. Whatever came next in their struggle for survival, they would face it as what they had always truly been, a family reunited by fate and strengthened by the knowledge that some connections transcend even death itself. The ancient stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains had witnessed the passage of countless generations of Apache warriors, each leaving their mark on the sacred cave paintings that decorated the hidden chambers deep within the rock. Now, as Dezba and Ayella made their desperate journey toward this final sanctuary, those painted spirits seemed to whisper across the centuries, offering both guidance and warning to the last members of a family line that had survived too much. To surrender now, Chief Victorio's war shield, decorated with symbols of protection that had been blessed by the most powerful medicine men of 3 tribes, rested against the cave wall where it had been placed, in preparation for what everyone knew would be their final stand. The great leader himself sat in council with his most trusted warriors, their painted faces reflecting the gravity of decisions that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of Apache resistance in the territory. Dezba and Ayella arrived at the stronghold as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, their small figures silhouetted against the vast expanse of desert that had become both their sanctuary and their battleground. The weeks of constant flight had taken their toll. Ayella's face was thinner now, marked by the kind of premature wisdom that comes from facing adult realities at far too young an age, while Dezba moved with the careful economy of a man who knew his strength was finite and must be conserved for the battles ahead. The reunion with Victorio's band was both joyful and heartbreaking. Warriors who had known Dezba since childhood embraced him like a brother returned from the dead, while the women and children gathered around Ayella with the protective tenderness that Apache people reserved for their most precious members. But underlying the warmth of their welcome was the cold knowledge that this gathering might be their last. "The soldiers come in numbers we have never seen," Victorio told Dezba as they sat together around the council fire that night, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. 3 companies of cavalry, supported by Apache scouts who have chosen the white man's path. They move like men who know they face their final battle as well. The political implications of the situation weighed heavily on everyone present. Captain Reynolds had convinced his superiors that recovering the governor's niece was worth committing significant military resources, while the Apache defectors had promised that eliminating Dezba and the child would demonstrate their usefulness to the territorial government. But the most disturbing intelligence came from friendly scouts who had infiltrated the cavalry camp and overheard conversations between Reynolds and his Apache allies. The captain's orders were clear. Ayella was to be recovered alive if possible, but if she showed signs of having been corrupted by Apache influence, she was to be eliminated to prevent any future embarrassment to her uncle's political career. "They fear what she represents," Victorio observed, his weathered face grave in the firelight. a child who bridges both worlds, who could grow up to speak for understanding instead of hatred. Such a voice could change everything if it were allowed to grow strong. The council debate that followed stretched deep into the night, with passionate arguments on all sides. Some warriors advocated for trading Ayella to the whites in exchange for safe passage to Mexico, reasoning that the needs of the many outweighed the fate of one child, even one they had come to love. Others argued for a fighting retreat deeper into the mountains, hoping to outlast the cavalry's patience and supplies. But the most powerful voice belonged to an unexpected speaker, Ayella herself, who stood before the council with a dignity that would have been remarkable in a grown woman, let alone a 6-year-old child. "My Apache name is Ayella," she began, speaking in the language that had become as natural to her as English during her weeks with Dezba. "I am the daughter of Paloma, who was sister to Itzel, who was wife to Dezba. I am niece to the white governor, but I am also niece to this Apache warrior who saved my life when my own people threw me away." The simple honesty of her words carried more weight than any political argument could have managed. Here was a child claiming her place in both worlds, refusing to be erased by either side's vision of racial purity. "The soldiers want to kill me because I remind them that Apache and white people can love each other," she continued, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "The white people want to kill me because they're afraid of what I might become if I'm allowed to remember who I really am." She paused, looking around the circle of painted faces that had become as familiar to her as family. "But I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to pretend to be someone I'm not just to make other people comfortable with their hatred. If they're going to kill me for being both Apache and white, then at least I want to die knowing who I really am." The courage in her declaration moved even the most hardened warriors to tears, and when the final vote was taken, the decision was unanimous. They would make their stand here in the ancient stronghold, not just to protect one child, but to defend the principle that love could transcend the boundaries that hatred had built between peoples. The next 2 days were spent in preparation that combined practical military planning with spiritual ceremony. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, while medicine men conducted rituals that called upon the spirits of ancestors to lend their strength to the coming battle. Ayella participated in these preparations with the solemnity of someone who understood that she was not just fighting for her own life, but for the right of all mixed heritage children to exist without shame or fear. Dezba spent much of this time teaching her the final lessons he wanted her to carry forward, regardless of what happened in the battle to come. How to read the flight patterns of birds to predict weather changes, how to find water in seemingly barren landscape, how to identify the plants that could heal wounds or ease pain. But most importantly, he shared the stories of her parents, not just the tragic circumstances of their deaths, but the love story that had brought them together despite every force arrayed against their union. "Your mother was the bravest woman I ever knew," he told her as they sat together on the cliff overlooking the desert where the final confrontation would soon take place. "She chose love over safety, truth over comfort. She married your father, knowing that both sides would hate them for it, but she believed their love was worth any price." He showed her the photograph again, pointing out details she might have missed, the way her mother's hand rested protectively over her heart, the quiet strength in her father's stance, the small silver cross that hung around Paloma's neck as a symbol of the faith that had sustained her through persecution. "They named you Ayella because they wanted you to be a flower that bloomed forever, something beautiful that would survive even when they were gone," Dezba continued. "Every choice you make now is part of keeping their love alive in the world." As the sun set on their final day of preparation, scouts brought word that Captain Reynolds and his combined force of cavalry and Apache defectors had been spotted less than 10 miles away, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their quarry was trapped and could afford to approach methodically. The time for running had ended. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building since that first moment beneath the stone bridge, when a grieving Apache warrior had chosen to protect an abandoned child instead of walking away from her pain. But as Ayella sat with the sacred war shield propped beside her, studying the ancient symbols that represented protection, courage, and the eternal cycle of life and death, she felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of absolute certainty about who she was and where she belonged. She was Ayella Hartwell, daughter of love that had defied hatred, carrier of two bloodlines that the world insisted must remain separate. Tomorrow she might die, but she would die as herself, not as the sanitized version that others wanted to create from her existence. The painted spirits on the cave walls seemed to nod their approval as she made this final peace with her destiny. And somewhere in the desert night, she could almost hear her parents' voices whispering their pride across the years that separated the living from the dead. Dawn came to the Dragoon Mountains with deceptive peace, the desert silence broken only by the soft whisper of wind through ancient stone and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the hidden stronghold. But Dezba's trained ear caught the wrongness in the morning's rhythm. The absence of smaller birds, the unnatural stillness that spoke of human predators moving through the landscape with deadly purpose. Captain Reynolds had chosen his approach, using the pre-dawn darkness to position his forces on 3 sides of the Apache stronghold, while keeping his Apache allies in reserve to block any escape route toward Mexico. The tactical situation was almost hopeless. Nearly 60 armed soldiers and treacherous scouts against fewer than 20 Apache warriors, with women, children, and elders to protect in the confined space of the cave system. But as Dezba studied the terrain from his position among the rocks above the main cave entrance, he saw opportunities that his military training had taught him to recognize. The sacred cave paintings that decorated the walls weren't just spiritual symbols. They were a map left by his ancestors, showing the location of hidden passages and defensive positions that had been used for generations to turn apparent traps into victorious battlefields. "Remember," he whispered to Ayella as she crouched beside him, her small hands steady as she checked the knife he had given her for emergencies. "You are not just fighting for yourself today. You carry the spirits of your parents, of Ayella, of all the children who deserve to live free from hatred." She nodded, her dark eyes reflecting a calm that would have been impossible just weeks ago. The terrified child who had wept beneath the stone bridge had been transformed by love and purpose into someone who understood that some battles were worth any sacrifice. The first shots came from the eastern approach, where Reynolds had positioned his sharpshooters to provide covering fire for the main assault. But instead of the devastating barrage the captain expected, the Apache defenders seemed to melt away like smoke, disappearing into crevices and hidden passages that didn't appear on any military map. Dezba's strategy was elegantly simple: use the superior knowledge of terrain that his people had accumulated over centuries to turn the cavalry's numerical advantage into a liability. In the narrow confines of the cave system, horses became useless and disciplined formations impossible. The battle would be fought on Apache terms, using Apache methods perfected through generations of warfare against overwhelming odds. Ayella proved crucial to the plan's success in ways that surprised even Dezba. Her small size allowed her to move through passages that grown warriors couldn't navigate, carrying messages between defensive positions and creating diversions that confused the attacking forces about the true number and location of their enemies. "There!" shouted Private Henderson, the same soldier who had nearly discovered her beneath the bridge weeks ago. "I saw movement in those rocks." But when his squad moved to investigate, they found only empty stone and the faint echo of childish laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ayella had learned well from her weeks in the desert, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had truly become part of the landscape she defended. The psychological effect on the cavalry was significant. They had come expecting to face a conventional enemy, Apache warriors fighting from fixed positions that could be overwhelmed by superior firepower and numbers. Instead, they found themselves in a maze of stone passages where their enemies appeared and vanished like spirits, where every shadow might conceal a defender, where the very rocks seemed to fight against their intrusion. Captain Reynolds, watching his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos, began to understand that he was facing more than just military resistance. This was a spiritual battle, fought on ground that had been sacred to the Apache people for countless generations, defended by warriors who saw death as preferable to surrender. But the first phase of the battle also brought Apache reinforcements that no one had expected. Chief Victorio himself appeared on the high ridge overlooking the stronghold, leading a band of 20 seasoned warriors who had ridden through the night to join the defense. The great chief's presence transformed the tactical situation from desperate to merely difficult, giving the defenders enough strength to consider victory rather than just honorable death. "My brothers," Victorio called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the battlefield with commanding authority, "today, we fight not just for one child, but for the right of all our children to exist, free from the hatred that would erase them from the world." The response from the hidden defenders was a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, a sound that spoke of courage, undaunted by impossible odds and love, stronger than the fear of death. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, both sides prepared for the decisive phase of a battle that would determine whether love or hatred would ultimately triumph in the unforgiving landscape of the American Southwest. The final confrontation came when Captain Reynolds, desperate to salvage his mission and his career, made the tactical mistake that Dezba had been waiting for. Abandoning his defensive positions, the cavalry officer led a direct assault on the main cave entrance, confident that overwhelming force could succeed where strategy had failed. But as his soldiers charged across the open ground, Ayella emerged from her hiding place in full view of the attacking force, standing proud and unafraid on a rocky outcrop that made her visible to every man on the battlefield. "I am Ayella Hartwell," she called out, her clear voice carrying across the desert morning with startling authority. "I am the daughter of Jonathan and Paloma, who loved each other despite your hatred. I am Apache and white, and I will not hide from either part of who I am." The declaration stopped the cavalry charge in its tracks, as soldiers who had expected to be fighting savage warriors found themselves facing a 6-year-old girl who spoke with the dignity of someone 3 times her age. Captain Reynolds raised his sidearm, but hesitated as he realized that shooting an unarmed child in front of his own men would be difficult to justify in any official report. "You don't understand what you're saying, child," he called back, trying to maintain his authority while processing this unexpected development. "You've been brainwashed by these savages. We're here to save you from a life of degradation and violence. The only violence I've seen came from people who look like you," Ayella replied, with devastating honesty. "Dezba saved me when my own white family threw me away. He taught me how to survive, how to be brave, how to honor the memory of parents who died for loving across the lines that hatred drew between peoples." Dezba's father's lance, passed down through 4 generations of Apache warriors, felt perfectly balanced in his weathered hands as he stepped into view beside Ayella. The weapon had been blessed by medicine men, decorated with eagle feathers, that spoke of courage in battle and carved with symbols that connected its bearer to all the warriors who had wielded it before him. "She speaks truth," he said in English, ensuring that every soldier could understand his words. This child was abandoned by white people who were supposed to protect her. She chose to stay with Apache family who love her for exactly who she is, not who they want her to become. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in the military history of the Arizona Territory. On one side stood a small Apache family, a warrior, a child, and the spirits of ancestors whose paintings watched from the cave walls behind them. On the other stood the full military might of the territorial government, backed by Apache traitors who had chosen cooperation over resistance. But as the tense moments stretched into minutes, something unexpected began to happen among the cavalry ranks. Soldiers who had joined the army to fight savage enemies found themselves looking at a man protecting a child with obvious love, defending her right to choose her own identity rather than accept the one that others wanted to impose on her. The final confrontation came when Captain Reynolds, desperate to salvage his mission and his career, made the tactical mistake that Dezba had been waiting for. Abandoning his defensive positions, the cavalry officer led a direct assault on the main cave entrance, confident that overwhelming force could succeed where strategy had failed. But as his soldiers charged across the open ground, Ayella emerged from her hiding place in full view of the attacking force, standing proud and unafraid on a rocky outcrop that made her visible to every man on the battlefield. "I am Ayella Hartwell," she called out, her clear voice carrying across the desert morning with startling authority. "I am the daughter of Jonathan and Paloma, who loved each other despite your hatred. I am Apache and white, and I will not hide from either part of who I am." The declaration stopped the cavalry charge in its tracks, as soldiers who had expected to be fighting savage warriors found themselves facing a 6-year-old girl who spoke with the dignity of someone 3 times her age. Captain Reynolds raised his sidearm, but hesitated as he realized that shooting an unarmed child in front of his own men would be difficult to justify in any official report. "You don't understand what you're saying, child," he called back, trying to maintain his authority while processing this unexpected development. "You've been brainwashed by these savages. We're here to save you from a life of degradation and violence. The only violence I've seen came from people who look like you," Ayella replied, with devastating honesty. "Dezba saved me when my own white family threw me away. He taught me how to survive, how to be brave, how to honor the memory of parents who died for loving across the lines that hatred drew between peoples." Dezba's father's lance, passed down through 4 generations of Apache warriors, felt perfectly balanced in his weathered hands as he stepped into view beside Ayella. The weapon had been blessed by medicine men, decorated with eagle feathers, that spoke of courage in battle, and carved with symbols that connected its bearer to all the warriors who had wielded it before him. "She speaks truth," he said in English, ensuring that every soldier could understand his words. This child was abandoned by white people who were supposed to protect her. She chose to stay with Apache family who love her for exactly who she is, not who they want her to become. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in the military history of the Arizona Territory. On one side stood a small Apache family, a warrior, a child, and the spirits of ancestors whose paintings watched from the cave walls behind them. On the other stood the full military might of the territorial government, backed by Apache traitors who had chosen cooperation over resistance. But as the tense moments stretched into minutes, something unexpected began to happen among the cavalry ranks. Soldiers who had joined the army to fight savage enemies found themselves looking at a man protecting a child with obvious love, defending her right to choose her own identity rather than accept the one that others wanted to impose on her. Private Henderson, the tracker who had nearly discovered them weeks ago, was the first to lower his weapon. "Captain," he said quietly, "this ain't what we signed up for." Fighting warriors is one thing, but shooting a man for protecting his daughter, that's something else entirely. Other soldiers began to murmur agreement, their weapons wavering as they processed the moral complexity of their situation. They had come expecting to rescue a kidnapped white child from savage captors, but instead found a family that had chosen each other despite every force arrayed against them. Captain Reynolds felt his authority slipping away as more soldiers began to question the mission. His Apache allies, sensing the shift in momentum, began to back away from their positions, unwilling to fight alone against warriors who had the moral high ground as well as tactical advantages. "This is mutiny!" Reynolds shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I have direct orders from the territorial governor himself. That child is white property, and she belongs with white people." "I belong with people who love me," Ayella said simply, taking Dezba's free hand in hers. "And if loving someone whose skin is different from yours makes you property, then your laws are wrong, not our love." The wisdom in her words, spoken with the clarity that only children possess, seemed to echo off the canyon walls and settle into the hearts of men who had forgotten what they were supposedly fighting to protect. Chief Victorio chose that moment to appear on the ridge above them, his war-painted warriors visible against the morning sky, like ancient spirits come to witness this moment of reckoning. Enough blood has been spilled over the question of whether different peoples can live in peace, the great chief called down to the assembled forces. This child and this warrior prove that love can bridge any divide if we have the courage to let it. Captain Reynolds, isolated now even among his own men, made one final desperate play. Drawing his sidearm, he pointed it directly at Ayella and shouted, "If I can't take her back alive, then she dies here as a lesson to anyone else who thinks they can defy the natural order." But before he could pull the trigger, Private Henderson's rifle cracked across the desert morning, and Reynolds fell to the ground, his weapon spinning away across the rocky ground. "Some orders ain't worth following," Henderson said quietly, lowering his smoking rifle. "And some children deserve better than the world we adults have made for them." In the stunned silence that followed, Ayella walked slowly down from her rocky perch and approached the wounded cavalry officer. Looking down at him with more compassion than he deserved, she spoke words that would be remembered long after the political implications of this day had faded into history. "I forgive you for trying to kill me," she said simply. "But I won't forget that you thought erasing who I am was worth more than letting me live as myself." The battle was over, won not through violence, but through the power of truth, spoken by someone too young to understand that such honesty was supposed to be impossible. As Chief Victorio's warriors came down from the ridge to tend the wounded and disarm the remaining cavalry forces, the sacred cave paintings seemed to glow with approval from ancestors who had waited generations to see love triumph over hatred in the desert they had called home. 6 months after the confrontation at the ancient stronghold, the Apache camp in the hidden valley beyond the Dragoon Mountains had taken on the peaceful rhythms of a people who had finally found a measure of security in an uncertain world. Children played among the wiki-ups while their mothers worked at traditional crafts, and the sound of laughter echoed off canyon walls that had witnessed too much sorrow in recent years. Ayella sat cross-legged beside the central fire, her fingers working, with practiced skill, at the intricate beadwork that would decorate the ceremonial dress being prepared for her formal adoption ceremony. The Apache name necklace that tribal elders had crafted for her, spelling out Little Brave Heart in traditional symbols, caught the firelight and seemed to glow with inner warmth. The transformation in her appearance over the past months was remarkable. Her skin had been bronzed by desert sun and wind. Her hair had grown long enough to braid with the colored threads that marked her status within the tribe, and her movements carried the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the desert's moods as naturally as breathing. But the most significant change was in her eyes. which no longer held the desperate fear of abandonment that had marked her earliest days with Dezba. Instead, they reflected the quiet confidence of a child who knew exactly where she belonged and who she was meant to become. The letter came. "This morning," Dezba said, settling beside her with the official document that had arrived via military courier. The territorial governor's seal was clearly visible on the heavy paper, though the contents were far different from anything Captain Reynolds might have expected to carry. Ayella looked up from her beadwork, her expression curious but untroubled. The political machinations of the white world seemed very distant from this place, where she was valued for who she was, rather than who others wanted her to become. "What does my uncle say?" she asked, using the Apache word for uncle that acknowledged their blood relationship, while making clear that she no longer considered herself bound by white family obligations. Dezba unfolded the letter and read the formal language with the careful attention he had learned to give all communications from the territorial government. Governor Hartwell's message was a masterpiece of political face-saving, acknowledging his niece's choice to remain with her Apache guardians, while praising the humanitarian values that had prevented further bloodshed. More importantly, the letter contained an official pardon for all Apache warriors involved in the confrontation, along with a substantial financial settlement that was described as compensation for past misunderstandings, but which everyone understood was payment for their discretion about certain embarrassing details of the governor's family history. "He says the bounty has been withdrawn," Dezba explained, translating the bureaucratic language into terms that honored both her intelligence and her youth. "No more soldiers will come looking for you. You are free to choose your own path." The formal adoption ceremony that followed 3 days later was unlike anything the tribe had conducted in living memory. Traditional Apache customs were blended with innovations that honored Ayella's unique position as a bridge between two worlds, creating rituals that celebrated both her Apache heritage and the white parents who had died for their love. Chief Victorio himself presided over the ceremony, his painted face grave with the responsibility of formally welcoming this child into the protection of the entire Apache nation. But when he spoke, his words carried warmth that went beyond political necessity into genuine affection for a little girl who had reminded them all that courage could triumph over fear. "Today, we welcome Ayella, little brave heart, into our family. Not just by choice, but by blood and spirit," the great chief announced as the assembled tribe watched with approval. "She carries the dreams of her parents who died for love, the strength of her Apache ancestors who survived everything the desert could send against them, and the hope of all children who will grow up in a world where difference is celebrated rather than feared." Dezba's own words during the ceremony reflected the journey they had traveled together, from that first meeting beneath the stone bridge to this moment of formal recognition as family. "When I found this child crying under a bridge, I thought I was saving her life," he said, his weathered hands resting gently on Ayella's shoulders. "But she was the one who saved me, who taught me that love can grow in the most unlikely places, who showed me that some bonds are stronger than the hatred that tries to divide us." The celebration that followed lasted deep into the night, with traditional songs and dances that welcomed Ayella into the full cultural life of her chosen people. But the most meaningful moment came near dawn, when she and Dezba sat together on the cliff overlooking the desert where their story had begun. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't climbed down from that ridge?" she asked, her question carrying the philosophical depth that their months together had nurtured in her young mind. Dezba considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out over the vast landscape that had witnessed their transformation, from strangers to family. "I think the spirits put us together at exactly the moment when we both needed saving," he replied, finally. "You needed someone who wouldn't abandon you when caring became difficult. I needed someone who could teach me that love doesn't end with a death, it just finds new ways to grow. The wooden horse that had started their relationship sat between them now, its painted symbols worn smooth by months of handling but still clearly visible in the pre-dawn light. It had become more than a toy or even a sacred object. It was a testament to the idea that some connections transcend every boundary that human prejudice can construct. As the sun rose over the Arizona desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise peace after years of conflict. Ayella, little brave heart, settled against Dezba's shoulder and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The world beyond their hidden valley remained complicated and often cruel. But here in this place where love had conquered hatred and family had been chosen rather than imposed, two wounded souls had found healing and home in each other's hearts.